over the weekend came the news that the Taliban had banned women's voices and faces in public. Banned.
According to the new rules, which cover all aspects of Afghan society, women are not allowed to sing, recite or read aloud in public. They are required to cover their faces.
This is the Taliban regime that Joe Biden wrongly believed had miraculously transformed into a modern movement when he pulled American forces out. Yet the Taliban is more repressive and brutal than ever, banning women's voices and faces. But here's what I want to know. Where were the protests? Where were the marches on the streets of Sydney, London, New York? Where were the rallies at college campuses around the world? This exposes that it's truly not the plight of Muslim women or children that the left cares about. The pro-Palestinian movement should really be called an anti-Israel or anti-Zionist movement, even an anti-Jew movement. Because how else to explain the stunning hypocrisy where not one person stood up to march for the women in Afghanistan? Meanwhile, the Albanese government is still struggling to explain to Australian voters why it's allowing Hamas supporters into the country. Defence Minister and Deputy PM Richard Marles was asked 4 times why visitor visas were being used from a terrorist hotspot instead of other visa classes that have rigorous security vetting. Well, he just couldn't answer.
Why did the government decide to give visitor visas last year and not some sort of temporary humanitarian visa?
Well, this has been a total distraction that has been run by the opposition over the course of the last 2 weeks. That's actually what's going on in the parliament right now, Andrew.
Why visitor visas?
What there is an attempt to distract from the fact that the opposition have nothing to say.
Mr. Marles, except they were never coming as visitors, were they? They weren't coming to see the Opera House. They were fleeing a war zone. So why wasn't there a humanitarian visa in place?
Again, I just come back to the fact that everyone has their own story in terms of the circumstances on which they are coming to Australia. But whatever that is, there is a security assessment which is done.
Are you satisfied then none of the people coming on those visitor visas will be a risk going forward?
I'm satisfied that all the security checks are in place in respect of this cohort, as have applied to any cohort who have come to this country. Yes, I am.
That was a great interview by Andrew Clennell. And then you had Bill Shorten, who did concede that Palestinians coming from Gaza could be Hamas supporters.
People coming from Gaza, I don't know, I've never had the misfortune to live under a terrorist regime. I don't know, David, if you lived in Gaza and you had to do a survey when you might depend on your food and the government does a survey and say, do you support Hamas? I don't know what you'd say, David, but you'd probably weigh up the interests of your family. The reality is the Hamas question is, I think, superseded by the way that governments of both sides have handled this issue, which is someone a security risk?
And those questions on the weekend came after Anthony Albanese refused to say in Parliament on Thursday that support for Hamas wouldn't preclude someone from being granted an Australian visa. If you missed it, here was that telling exchange.
Prime Minister, does supporting Hamas pass the character test for an Australian visa?
Everyone who applies for an Australian visa is subject to the same security standard set by the same agencies and the same personnel as under the former government.
Well, columnist Chris Mitchell today wrote about the fact that Albanese couldn't definitively declare that support for a prescribed terror group would deny someone access to a visa. And he said this is the real fault line in this left faction-led government that is unlike all previous Labor governments. And columnist Henry Ergas on the weekend brilliantly explained how ludicrous the accusations of racism are against Peter Dutton. And he wrote, it is hardly racist to oppose the entry into this country of genocidal racists. And Henry Ergas also points out the hypocrisy of the Albanese government, which has claimed that anti-Semitism has no place in Australia. That's what the Prime Minister has said. But yet, as Henry Ergas writes, how then could it possibly issue visas to people who sympathise, however rhetorically, with a movement based on a psychotic hostility to Jews? Is this country's social cohesion worth so little that it deserves to be shredded for the sake of a few votes? Well, it seems that under the Albanese government, that is indeed the case. And it's not just social cohesion that's being shredded, but national security and community safety are at peril too. Reckless and grave risks to take simply to help Labor hold on to marginal seats.